Have you ever had one of those moments where, like, a concept you've been struggling with just clicks into place?
Totally, like suddenly understanding something in a whole new way.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a light bulb moment,
Yeah.
right? Those aha moments. Well, today we're diving into the fascinating world of cognitive development. We're going to explore how our brains develop those thinking abilities to have those light bulb moments throughout our lives.
It's a pretty complex process, but we're going to break it down, focusing mainly on two big names in the field, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky.
These guys, their theories are like the cornerstones of how we understand how thinking progresses.
Yeah.
From when we're babies to when we're teenagers and even beyond.
Right, it's not just about knowing more as we age. They were really interested in how our way of thinking itself changes over time.
And for this deep dive, we've got a chapter from a really comprehensive textbook on cognitive development. It really digs into the core ideas of Piaget and Vygotsky. Compares and contrasts their views, talks about how their theories are viewed today.
Sounds good.
So our mission today is to unpack these theories. Sometimes they can be a bit complex, but we're going to make them clear and relatable. We'll use examples you can connect with, and hopefully you'll have a few of those aha moments yourself along the way. So let's kick things off with Jean Piaget, one of the pioneers in the field.
Okay, so Piaget was this Swiss psychologist, really fascinated by how kids think. He spent decades just observing them, even his own children.
Wow, decades. That's dedication.
Yeah, it was. And what he realized was kind of revolutionary at the time. He said, kids don't just know less than adults. They actually think in completely different ways.
Interesting.
Yeah. And a core idea in his theory is that kids are like little scientists, actively building their understanding of the world.
Not just passively absorbing information.
Right. They're constantly exploring, experimenting, figuring things out. And he used this concept of schemes to explain how this happens. Yeah, think of them as like mental frameworks or blueprints that we use to organize and understand information. When we're babies, these schemes are mostly actions like sucking, grasping, things like that.
Like a baby's got to put everything in their mouth.
Yeah, exactly. But as we get older, these schemes become more complex, more mental, like strategies for solving problems, your understanding of fairness, abstract ideas. Even something like how a car works. You have a scheme for that in your head.
So by the time we're adults, we have this like huge library of schemes for all sorts of things.
Yeah, that's the idea. And these schemes are constantly changing and evolving.
Right, and that's where assimilation and accommodation come in, right?
Exactly. So assimilation is kind of like fitting new info into an existing scheme. Like imagine a little kid who knows what a dog is, furry, 4 legs. Then they see a cat for the first time.
And they're like, oh, look, another dog.
Exactly. They try to assimilate the cat into their existing dog scheme.
But then accommodation happens when they start noticing the differences, right?
Yeah, they realize, wait a minute, this dog meows. It has different ears, a different tail. It doesn't quite fit.
So they either tweak their dog scheme or they create a whole new scheme for cat.
That's accommodation in action. And this process, assimilation and accommodation, it's going on all the time from the very beginning.
So even babies are doing this.
Yeah. Think about newborns. They'll suck on anything you put near their mouth that's assimilation, using their sucking scheme. But then they learn to adjust their sucking depending on whether it's a nipple or a finger. That's accommodation.
Fascinating. So our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world, adjusting our schemes as we go.
Right. And then there's organization. That's another key part of Piaget's theory.
It's organization.
So it's basically how we connect our schemes together, building them into more complex systems. It's about creating a more interconnected, efficient way of understanding the world. Like think about a child learning to ride a bike. At first, they're focusing on pedaling, steering, balancing, all separate. But through organization, they integrate these actions into a smooth, coordinated system for riding a bike.
So it's like taking all those individual skills and putting them all together.
Yep, creating a more sophisticated system.
But Piaget also believed that this whole process of learning and development isn't always smooth sailing.
Right.
He talked about this concept of equilibration.
Yeah, so equilibration is kind of like the engine that drives cognitive development. Piaget believed we're always striving for a state of balance in our thinking, where our schemes can explain our experiences.
We like things to make sense.
Exactly. But then we encounter something new that doesn't fit. Like that kid realizing not all furry, 4-legged things are dogs.
Throws them for a loop.
Yeah, and that's disequilibrium. It's that mental discomfort when things don't quite add up. And Piaget said this discomfort is what motivates us to learn and grow.
It pushes us to change our thinking.
Exactly. We accommodate, we assimilate, we reorganize until we reach a new state of equilibrium where things make sense again, but now with a more sophisticated understanding.
And those more advanced understandings, that's what Piaget described as stages of cognitive development, right?
Yeah, he proposed that there are 4 distinct stages, each with its own unique way of understanding the world.
So it's not just that we know more as we get older, but our whole way of thinking changes.
Right, that was his big idea.
So the first stage is the sensorimotor stage, from birth to about 2 years old.
Yeah, and it's called sensorimotor because infants at this stage are mainly understanding the world through their senses and their motor actions. What they can see, hear, touch, and what they can do with their bodies.
Makes sense. They're exploring the world through their senses.
Exactly. And at first it's all about reflexes, like that sucking reflex we talked about. But over time, they develop more complex sensorimotor patterns and even start to use primitive symbols.
Symbols? Like how?
Like they might start to understand that a certain sound means mommy's coming, or a gesture means they're going to get picked up.
Wow, so even at that young age, they're starting to connect things in their minds.
Oh, yeah. And one of the major milestones in the stage is developing object permanence.
Object permanence.
It's the understanding that objects continue to exist even when you can't see them.
So like when you play peekaboo with a baby, and they get so surprised when you reappear.
Exactly. For a young baby, when you cover your face, you're gone. They haven't developed that understanding that you still exist behind your hands. And Piaget studied this by hiding toys and seeing if infants would search for them.
And if they did?
That was evidence they were starting to grasp object permanence. And it's a big deal because it means they're starting to understand that the world is made up of stable, lasting objects, not just things that disappear when they're out of sight.
But some research suggests that babies might actually understand this earlier than Piaget thought, right?
Yeah.
Like the work of Renée Bilargen.
Yeah, she's done some really cool studies using this method called violation of expectations.
Violation of expectation.
The idea is that babies, even really young ones, have certain expectations about how the world works. And if you show them something that violates those expectations, something that seems impossible, they'll stare at it longer, like they're surprised.
So they're like, wait, that's not how things are supposed to work.
Exactly. So Bilargen did this experiment where she showed babies a screen that rotated back and forth. Then she put in a box behind the screen and made it look like the screen was passing right through the box. And even babies as young as 3.5 months old would stare longer at this impossible event.
So it's like they understand that the box should have stopped the screen.
Right. And that suggests they might have some basic understanding of object permanence even earlier than Piaget proposed. And it wasn't just object permanence. Her studies also indicated that infants might understand some basic ideas about cause and effect earlier than expected. Like they seem to know that a bigger object is more likely to make another object move.
So babies are smarter than we give them credit for.
It seems that way. Bilargen even proposed this idea called the principle of persistence, which suggests that babies are kind of born with this assumption that objects are solid and exist continuously in time and space unless something acts on them. It's a pretty interesting challenge to Piaget's emphasis on learning solely through sensory and motor experiences.
So nature versus nurture is a big debate here.
Definitely.
Now, Piaget also talked about this thing called the A not B error that babies sometimes make. What's that all about?
Okay, so imagine you hide a toy under a blanket, let's call it location A, and the baby sees you do it and finds the toy.
They're like, I got it.
Right. Then you hide the toy under a different blanket, location B, while the baby is watching.
So they see where you hid it this time.
Exactly. But often the baby will still reach for the first blanket, location A, even though they saw you hide it in location B.
That's so weird. Why would they do that?
Well, Piaget thought this showed that their understanding of object permanence wasn't fully developed yet. But more recent research suggests there might be other explanations.
Like what?
Well, it could be a memory thing. Maybe they just have trouble remembering the new location, especially if there's a delay. Or it could be about attention. They might just be so focused on that first spot where they found the toy before.
Like they can't help but go back to the familiar.
Yeah. There's even the idea that it's about repeating a successful action. They were successful reaching for location A before, so they try it again.
So it might not be just about object permanence.
Right. It seems like it's more complex than that.
Makes sense. Now, in addition to all this research about babies, we hear a lot about the core knowledge approach. How does that fit into this discussion about cognitive development?
Yeah, so the core knowledge approach is championed by researchers like Elizabeth Spelk. They argue that babies aren't born with blank slates. They actually come into the world with some fundamental knowledge systems already in place.
Like pre-programmed knowledge.
Kind of. They suggest that babies have a basic understanding of things like space, number, objects, and even language. And these core knowledge systems help them learn about the world quickly and efficiently.
Like a head start on learning.
Exactly. And they argue that these systems are probably the result of evolution, things that helped babies survive throughout human history.
That makes sense.
Yeah. But there are other researchers, like Mark Johnson, who suggest that maybe babies don't have fully formed knowledge at birth, but rather soft biases.
Soft biases. What are those?
It's like having a predisposition to pay attention to certain types of information or learn about things in particular ways. These biases guide their learning, but they're not rigid, pre-programmed knowledge.
So more like tendencies than fixed knowledge.
Right. And critics of the core knowledge approach also point out that even very young babies have already had weeks or months of sensory experiences, which could play a bigger role than the core knowledge folks sometimes acknowledge.
Yeah, those first few months are a whirlwind of new experiences for babies. And social interaction is huge too, right?
Definitely. Babies are learning so much from their caregivers and the people around them.
So where do we land on all of this? What's the current thinking about cognitive development in the sensoromotor stage?
Well, I think the general consensus is that PROC probably underestimated just how much babies are capable of understanding right from the start.
Like maybe they don't start with a totally blank slate?
Right. But that doesn't mean experience isn't important. Sensoromotor interactions, all those explorations and experiences, are still crucial for development. It's really this complex interplay between nature and nurture, some innate predispositions, but also the critical role of experience and learning.
Okay, that makes sense. So after the sensoromotor stage, we move on to the pre-operational stage, which is roughly from ages 2 to 7.
Yeah, so this is a time of huge growth in symbolic thinking.
Symbolic thinking.
It means kids are starting to use symbols, words, images, drawings, to represent things that aren't physically present.
Like they can start to pretend?
Exactly. Pretend play really takes off during this stage.
Yeah.
And their language skills just explode. It's like they're finally able to express all these thoughts and ideas that have been brewing in their minds.
So they're using symbols to understand and represent the world around them.
Right. But Piaget called it pre-operational because he believed that kids at this age haven't yet mastered what he called operations.
Operations.
These are like internalized mental actions that are reversible and allow for logical thinking. And because pre-operational kids haven't quite got these operations down yet, their thinking has some limitations, like egocentrism.
Egocentrism.
Yeah, it basically means they have trouble seeing things from another person's perspective. Like Piaget did this famous experiment where he showed kids a model of 3 mountains, each one different.
Okay.
And the kid would be sitting on one side of the model, and Piaget would ask them to describe what someone sitting on the other side would see. Well, most pre-operational kids would just describe what they themselves were seeing. They couldn't really imagine that the other person would have a different viewpoint.
Interesting.
And then there's animism. That's the tendency to think inanimate objects are alive and have feelings.
Like my teddy bear is sad because I dropped him.
Exactly. It's all part of them still figuring out the difference between their own inner world and the external world.
So that like their imagination is running wild.
Yeah. And their drawings often reflect this. You might see a blue sun or a house floating in the sky. It all makes perfect sense in their minds.
They're not bound by the rules of reality yet.
Not yet. And Piaget divided the pre-operational stage into 2 substages, the symbolic function substage and the intuitive thought substage.
Okay, tell me about those.
So the symbolic function substage is roughly from ages 2 to 4, and that's when kids are really starting to use symbols in a big way. They can pretend a block is a car, they start telling stories, their language develops rapidly.
It's like their world is opening up.
Exactly. Then, from about ages 4 to 7, they move into the intuitive thought substage.
What happens then?
They start asking a lot of why questions. They're trying to figure things out, but their reasoning is still based on intuition and gut feelings rather than logic. They have a hard time understanding things they can't directly see or events that happened in the past.
So it's like they're starting to think more, but not quite in a logical way yet.
Right. And another big thing during this substage is the concept of centration.
Santrock.
It means they tend to focus on only one aspect of a situation and ignore other important aspects. And this leads to their lack of conservation.
Conservation. That's one of Piaget's most famous ideas.
It is. So conservation is the understanding that the amount of something stays the same, even if its appearance changes, as long as you haven't added or taken anything away. Like the classic example is pouring the same amount of liquid into different shaped glasses. A tall, skinny glass and a short, wide glass.
And a pre-operational child would say the tall glass has more because the liquid level is higher.
Exactly. They're centrating on the height and ignoring the width.
So they can't mentally reverse the action of pouring it back into the original glass.
Right. And this applies to other things too, like number, matter, length.
Like if you take 2 equal balls of Play-Doh and roll one out into a long snake, they might say the snake has more Play-Doh because it's longer.
Exactly. But there's been some interesting research showing that if you design tasks in a way that helps kids focus on the relevant features, they can sometimes demonstrate conservation skills earlier than Piaget thought.
So maybe their understanding is there, but they need help applying it.
That seems to be the case.
Okay, so then we get to the concrete operational stage. This is roughly from ages 7 to 11.
Right. And this is when kids start to really master those logical operations we talked about. They become much better at thinking logically about concrete objects and events.
So no more pouring water into different glasses and thinking the amount changed.
For the most part, no. They can now mentally reverse actions so they understand conservation. And they're less egocentric. They can consider different perspectives.
They're also developing other important cognitive abilities, like classification and seriation.
Yeah, classification is about organizing things into categories and understanding the relationships between those categories, like knowing that a dog is a mammal, which is a type of animal, and seriation is the ability to put things in order based on some characteristic, like arranging sticks from shortest to longest.
And they can also use transitivity, right?
Yeah, that's the ability to understand logical relationships between things. If A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then A must also be bigger than C. It seems obvious to us, but it's a skill that develops.
So concrete operational kids are becoming much more logical thinkers.
Definitely. But their thinking is still tied to concrete experiences. They haven't quite mastered abstract reasoning yet.
Okay, which brings us to the final stage in Piaget's theory, the formal operational stage. This typically starts around age 11 or 15 and continues into adulthood.
And this is when people develop the ability to think abstractly.
Abstractly.
Yeah, they can think about hypothetical situations, possibilities, things that aren't directly in front of them. They can understand complex concepts like algebra and philosophy.
So this is where we start to see more sophisticated thinking.
Exactly. They can think about their own thinking, which is called metacognition.
That's pretty deep.
It is, and they become more idealistic, thinking about ideal societies and perfect solutions to problems.
Like imagining a world without poverty or war.
Exactly. And they start to use hypothetical deductive reasoning.
Hypothetical deductive reasoning. Sounds complicated.
It's basically a scientific way of thinking. You start with a hypothesis, then you test it systematically, and you draw conclusions based on the evidence.
Like a real scientist.
Right. So Piaget believed that once someone reached this formal operational stage, the basic structure of their thinking was set. They wouldn't go through any more fundamental changes, although they would obviously continue to learn and gain knowledge.
But he did notice that adolescents, when they first enter this stage, might rely more on assimilation at first.
Yeah, they try to fit all these new abstract ideas into their existing schemes.
Makes sense.
But then as they get more experience, accommodation takes over and they adjust their thinking to fit the new information. But there have been some criticisms of Piaget's idea of formal operations.
What kind of criticisms?
Well, research has shown that not everyone reaches this stage. And even those who do might not use formal operational thinking consistently in every situation.
So it's not like you hit a certain age and suddenly you're a master of abstract thought.
Right. It seems to be more gradual and influenced by factors like culture, education, and individual experiences.
And speaking of adolescence, this is where David Elkin's concept of adolescent egocentrism comes in, right?
Yeah, but it's important to note this isn't the same kind of egocentrism that Piaget talked about in younger kids.
How is it different?
So Adolescent egocentrism is all about this heightened self-consciousness that teenagers often experience.
Like they feel like everyone's watching them.
Exactly. It's like they have this imaginary audience constantly scrutinizing their every move. They think everyone's as preoccupied with them as they are with themselves.
Ah, the classic teenage drama.
Yeah, and it also includes this thing called the personal fable.
Personal fable.
It's the belief that their experiences are totally unique and special. Like, no one else has ever felt what they're feeling or gone through what they're going through.
So they feel misunderstood.
Exactly. And it can also lead to this feeling of invincibility, like nothing bad could ever happen to them.
It's like they're the main character in a movie.
In a way, yeah. And this whole idea of the imaginary audience and the personal fable is really interesting to think about in the context of social media.
Yeah, like all those selfies and carefully curated profiles could be seen as feeding into this imaginary audience and this sense of a personal fable.
Definitely. Some researchers think social media might actually amplify these tendencies in teenagers. It gives them this platform to present an idealized version of themselves, and they're constantly comparing themselves to others.
It's a whole new layer of complexity.
It is. And that sense of invincibility that comes with the personal fable, it's not all bad.
Really?
It actually seems to have two sides: danger and vulnerability, and psychological invulnerability.
Explain those.
Okay, so danger and vulnerability is the belief that you're less likely to experience negative physical consequences from risky behaviors.
Like, I can totally text and drive, nothing bad will happen to me.
Right, and that's obviously dangerous. But psychological invulnerability is different. It's about feeling resilient to emotional pain and distress.
So, like being able to bounce back from setbacks.
Exactly. And studies have shown that psychological invulnerability can actually be a good thing. It can help teenagers cope with stress and challenges.
Interesting. So it's not just about being reckless?
No, it can also be about being resilient.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with Piaget's theory. Now, how has all of this been applied in the field of education?
So Piaget wasn't really an educator himself, but his ideas have had a huge impact on teaching practices. His constructivist view of learning, the idea that kids actively build their knowledge, has led to more hands-on, interactive learning environments.
So less rote memorization and more active exploration.
Exactly. And teachers are encouraged to be more like facilitators, guiding students to discover things for themselves rather than just lecturing at them.
It's about figuring out what a child is ready to learn and providing them with the right support and experiences.
Right. Piaget emphasized that kids need to learn at their own pace. You can't force them into higher cognitive stages before they're ready.
Yeah, that makes sense. So a classroom based on Piaget's principles might have lots of group work, problem-solving activities, experiments, things like that.
Absolutely. It's about creating a stimulating environment where kids can explore, experiment, and build their understanding.
So when we look back at Piaget's theory as a whole,
Mm.
what are the key takeaways?
Well, Piaget made some incredible contributions. He basically founded the field of developmental psychology. He gave us this whole framework for understanding how kids' thinking develops. And he really changed the way we view children, seeing them as active, capable thinkers, not just miniature adults.
A huge shift in perspective.
It was. And his work has inspired a ton of research. But of course, there have been some criticisms in areas where his theory has been modified over time.
Like what?
Well, there's debate about whether his age ranges for the stages are always accurate. And some argue that the stage concept itself is too rigid, that development is more continuous and fluid than Piaget suggested.
And what about the role of culture and social factors?
Yeah, Piaget didn't really focus on those as much, and now we know they play a big role in cognitive development. And there's a question of how much we can actually accelerate cognitive development through specific teaching methods.
Like, can we speed up the process?
That's a big question. And there's this whole group of neo-Piagetian theorists who have tried to integrate some of these criticisms into Piaget's framework, incorporating ideas from information processing theories about attention, memory, and strategies.
So they're building on Piaget's foundation.
That's the idea. So Piaget's theory is incredibly influential, but it's not the whole story.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's move on to Lev Vygotsky, another giant in the field of cognitive development. His theory offers a very different but equally important perspective.
Yeah, so Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist working around the same time as Piaget, and he also believed that children actively construct their knowledge. But unlike Piaget, who really emphasized the individual child's interaction with the physical world, Vygotsky focused on the crucial role of social interaction and culture in shaping cognitive development.
So more about how the social environment influences learning.
Exactly. He saw learning as this fundamentally social process where kids learn by interacting with more knowledgeable people, like adults or more skilled peers, and by internalizing the tools and practices of their culture.
So it's not just about figuring things out on your own, but learning from others.
Right. And a core concept in Vygotsky's theory is the zone of proximal development, often called the ZPD for short.
The ZPD, what's that?
So it's basically the range of tasks that a child can't yet do independently, but can do with guidance and support from someone more knowledgeable.
Like those moments when you're struggling with something and then a teacher or a friend gives you just the right hint and suddenly you get it.
Yeah. Exactly. That's the ZPD in action. Vygotsky believed that learning happens most effectively in this zone, where you're being challenged just enough, but with the right support. And the ZPD has two limits. The lower limit is what the child can already do on their own, and the upper limit is what they can potentially achieve with help. So the idea is that learning within this zone pulls development upward.
It helps you reach your potential.
Exactly. And this brings us to the concept of scaffolding.
Scaffolding. Like what construction workers use.
Kind of. It's the idea that the more knowledgeable person provides temporary support to help the learner master a task within their ZPD.
Like giving them hints, breaking the task down into smaller steps, providing examples.
Exactly. And as the learner becomes more competent, you gradually withdraw the support, just like removing scaffolding from a building once it's strong enough to stand on its own.
So you're providing just the right amount of support at each step of the way.
That's the key. And Vygotsky also believed that dialogue is super important in scaffolding. It's through talking, asking questions, explaining things that the learner really starts to internalize the concepts.
It's like talking helps make the learning stick.
Yeah. And Vygotsky also had some interesting ideas about language and thought. He actually saw language as a tool for thinking, not just for communicating.
That's different from how Piaget viewed it.
Yeah. Piaget thought that young kids talking to themselves, what he called egocentric speech, was just a sign of their immaturity.
Like they're just thinking out loud.
Right. But Vygotsky called it private speech, and he believed it was actually a crucial step in cognitive development.
Really?
Yeah. He said that kids use private speech to plan, guide, and monitor their own actions. It helps them solve problems and regulate their behavior.
So it's like they're talking themselves through a task.
Exactly. And he believed that language and thought start out separate, but then gradually become intertwined. First, kids use language for social communication, then they start using private speech to guide their own thinking, and eventually this private speech becomes internalized as inner speech.
So inner speech is what?
It's basically our thoughts, the silent dialogue we have with ourselves in our heads.
Wow, so our thoughts are kind of like internalized language.
That was Vygotsky's idea. And he even suggested that kids who use more private speech tend to be more socially competent.
Which is the opposite of what Piaget thought.
Right. Vygotsky saw private speech as a sign of developing self-regulation and problem-solving skills.
That's fascinating. So how can we use Vygotsky's theory in education?
Well, one of the big applications is the idea of teaching within a student's ZPD, finding that sweet spot where they're being challenged but have enough support to succeed.
So not too easy, not too hard.
Exactly. And collaborative learning, where students work together and help each other, is another application of Vygotsky's ideas. And teachers are encouraged to pay attention to and even encourage private speech in younger kids.
To help them develop those self-regulation skills.
Right. And creating learning activities that are meaningful and relevant to the students' lives is also important.
It's about making connections to the real world.
Yeah. And we talked earlier about the Tools of the Mind curriculum, which is directly based on Vygotsky's theory.
Remind me about that.
It's an early childhood curriculum that really emphasizes self-regulation, using things like dramatic play to help kids learn to follow rules and control their impulses.
Sounds fun.
It is. And they use scaffolding and encourage private speech. There's a lot of emphasis on play and interaction.
So it's a very hands-on social approach to learning.
Exactly. And studies have shown that it can be really effective, especially for kids from low-income communities.
That's great to hear. So overall, how do we evaluate Vygotsky's theory? What are its strengths?
Well, Vygotsky's biggest contribution was highlighting the importance of social and cultural factors in cognitive development. His concept of the ZPC is a really valuable tool for understanding how learning happens and how to support learners effectively. And his insights into language and thought have been hugely influential. He offered a really powerful alternative to Piaget's more individualistic approach.
Of course, there are also criticisms.
There are. Some say that Vygotsky wasn't as clear about the specific age-related changes in thinking that Piaget described in his stages, and some argue that he didn't pay enough attention to individual differences in learning or the role of emotions. Some also think he might have overemphasized the role of language. And there are practical challenges, like implementing scaffolding effectively in a busy classroom. And there's always the concern that too much guidance might stifle kids' natural curiosity and exploration.
So like anything, it's about finding the right balance.
Exactly.
So we've looked at Piaget, we've looked at Vygotsky, two really different but also complementary perspectives on cognitive development.
Yeah, they both agreed that kids actively construct their knowledge. But Piaget was more focused on the individual child interacting with the physical world, leading to changes in their internal cognitive structures. And Vygotsky was more about the social and cultural interactions that provide the tools and guidance for cognitive growth. For Piaget, it was a universal sequence of stages driven by this internal search for equilibrium. And for Vygotsky, development was more dependent on culture and social interaction. It's fascinating to see how their ideas have shaped the field.
It is. And we've talked a lot about childhood and adolescence, but what about adulthood? Did Piaget or Vygotsky have much to say about how our thinking continues to evolve as we get older?
That's interesting. Neither of them really focused on cognitive development beyond adolescence in a big way. Piaget saw formal operations, that stage of abstract thinking that develops during adolescence, as the final stage. He believed that adults basically continue to use the same kind of thinking, just with more knowledge and experience.
So like the structure of thinking is set, but the content changes.
Right. But even Piaget acknowledged that not everyone reaches formal operations. And many psychologists now believe that thinking does continue to evolve in adulthood.
Makes sense. We face different challenges and demands as adults.
Exactly. And there's this idea of realistic and pragmatic thinking, which suggests that as young adults enter the workforce and start dealing with real-world responsibilities, their thinking becomes less idealistic and more practical.
Like, okay, here's how things actually work.
Yeah, exactly. And Warner Shea proposed that a key shift in adulthood is moving from acquiring knowledge to applying it, using what you're